He arrived in America with $25 and 7 flutes, and he died the richest man the country had ever produced. But the fortune he built didn't stay simple for long. One of his descendants would fake his own death to escape his own family. Another would die on the most famous ship in history, refusing a seat he could have taken. And within 4 generations, a New York courtroom would rule, in effect, that the person closest to the last of that fortune wasn't legally an Astor at all. This is the story of how a butcher's son from a German village built something so large that his own descendants spent the next century fighting over what it meant to carry his name. To understand how strange that ending is, you have to start with how ordinary the beginning was. He was born Johann Jacob Astor on the 17th of July, 1763, in the small village of Waldorf near Heidelberg, the son of a local butcher. There was nothing about that birth that suggested an empire. At 16, he left for London to work with his brother, who made and sold musical instruments. It was steady work. It didn't hold him. He kept hearing about a country across the ocean where a man without a title could apparently make himself rich from nothing. And in March of 1784, he tested that idea directly, arriving in Baltimore with 7 flutes to sell and about $25 in his pocket. That was the entire foundation. No family land, no connections that mattered yet, just a young man who made his way north to New York, where an older brother had already settled, and took whatever work he could find, including, for a while, working behind a butcher's counter, the exact trade he had left Germany to escape. What changed his direction was fur. He started buying pelts from trappers and indigenous traders around New York, learned the business from the ground rather than from any formal training, and in 1786 opened his own small shop. By 1800 he had turned that shop into $250,000, helped enormously by the 1794 Jay Treaty, which opened trade routes into Canada and the Great Lakes that had previously been closed to American merchants. That same year, he expanded into direct trade with China, shipping furs, tea, and, alongside them, opium, a business many American and European merchants engaged in at the time, but one that has not aged well in the retelling. By 1808, he wasn't thinking like a merchant anymore. He founded the American Fur Company, chartered to control the fur trade across the Great Lakes and the newly acquired Columbia River Basin, and 2 years later formed the Pacific Fur Company specifically to open a shipping route from the Pacific Northwest straight to China. At the center of that plan sat a settlement he built at the mouth of the Columbia River and named after himself, Astoria. It was meant to be the western anchor of a trading empire that stretched across the entire continent. Then the War of 1812 arrived, and a remote fort 3,000 miles from any American military support had no realistic way to hold. British forces took it almost without resistance, and he was forced to sell his namesake settlement for a fraction of what he'd spent building it. He didn't dwell on the loss. The fur trade east of the Rockies was still his, and he kept it running for another 2 decades. A business that historians have since documented ran heavily on advanced credit and liquor, a system that kept many trappers perpetually in debt to the company that employed them. By the 1820s, a leaner, more nimble competitor out of the Rocky Mountains had started eating into that dominance, and rather than fight for ground he could feel slipping, he read the market instead. European fashion was starting to drift from beaver hats to silk. In June of 1834, he sold the American Fur Company outright near the top of a market about to decline, and walked away from the business that had made his name. Here is where the story could have simply ended, with a self-made fur baron cashing out at the right moment. Instead, it turned into something considerably larger, because for 35 years he had quietly been doing something else entirely. Starting in 1799, on his brother's advice, he had begun buying land in Manhattan. Farmland, mostly north of the built-up city, considered by his fellow merchants poor substitute for the faster returns of shipping and trade. He didn't sell it as it rose in value. He leased it, collecting ground rent indefinitely instead of cashing out once. It was a strategy that required patience almost none of his contemporaries had, and for 3 decades the two businesses ran side by side. Furs loud and visible, land quiet and compounding, until the land had quietly become the larger fortune. He died on the 29th of March, 1848, at 84. What he left behind is where the story gets its first real disagreement. One contemporary account puts his estate at roughly $20 million. Other, later estimates using different methods have placed the true scale of it considerably higher. Some economic historians, converting the fortune by share of the national economy rather than by raw dollars, have argued it was worth many times that. No two tellings agree on the exact figure, and it's worth holding that uncertainty rather than resolving it, because what isn't in dispute is simpler. Whatever the number, it made him, without real competition, the wealthiest man in the United States. Before he died, he put $400,000 toward a public library for New Yorkers who could never have afforded books otherwise, an institution that would later be absorbed into the New York Public Library. It's a strange thing to be the first line of a family's philanthropy and also the founder of a fortune, partly on debt bondage and the opium trade. Both things are true of him at once, and neither one erased the other. The man who inherited the bulk of that fortune was not, by his own father's blunt private assessment, someone built to expand it. William Backhouse Astor would never make money himself, the old man reportedly said, but he would keep whatever he was given. It's rarely kind to be summed up that precisely by your own father. It also turned out to be almost exactly right, though keeping it undersells what he actually did with 4 decades in charge of the largest private landholding in Manhattan. What he built with it was housing, on a scale genuinely unusual for a single individual to have constructed by hand. Over his lifetime, he put up close to 1,000 houses and hundreds of additional stores and dwellings across the uptown, lots his father had bought as farmland. And by 1867, he owned something in the neighborhood of 720 separate buildings. New Yorkers had a name for him by then, and it stuck for the rest of his life. The landlord of New York. That same year, a magazine survey of the city's 10 wealthiest men put his fortune at just over $16 million, more than $8 million ahead of the man in second place. He held that position, uncontested, for the rest of his life. Here's where the story needs a second person in it, because a fortune this size, built on this many buildings, was never abstract to the people who actually lived inside them. In 1845, a public health study examined exactly what that housing was doing to the families packed into it. The findings were stark enough that no one covering his death decades later could avoid mentioning them. 1/4 of children born in New York's tenement housing died before their first birthday, and a full third never lived to see their 5th. These weren't statistics floating somewhere outside his world. They described children living, in significant numbers, inside buildings that carried his name on the lease and generated rent that flowed to an office downtown and from there into his personal accounts. There's no record that he ever personally visited one of those buildings to see the conditions for himself. What makes the contrast land is what happened at the other end of that same money. His daughter-in-law, Caroline, ran a household where dinners were served on a 40-piece gold service. His son spent well over $2 million renovating a 62-room summer house in Newport that the family, without apparent irony, called a cottage. Newspapers covering William Backhouse Astor's death in 1875 noticed the gap and said so plainly. For all his wealth and all his acreage, there were no schools bearing his name, no hospitals, no parks, no reforms he'd personally funded inside his own tenement buildings. What newspapers also noted, almost as a footnote to that indictment, was where his energy for reform actually went. During the Civil War, when Congress introduced an income tax to help finance the Union war effort, he responded with a level of outrage and legal mobilization he had never once shown toward the conditions inside his own housing. Multiple biographical accounts describe him financing a successful legal challenge against that wartime tax. Money and lawyers deployed, in other words, not toward the documented deaths of children in buildings he owned, but toward protecting his own income from the government that was, at that exact moment, fighting a war. He died in November of 1875, leaving an estate close to $50 million, the largest private fortune in the country at the time. If the men of this family built the fortune, it was a woman who decided what it was actually for, and she did it with a title she simply invented for herself, and then dared anyone to take back. Caroline Schermerhorn had married into the family in 1853. After her father-in-law's death, she began referring to herself, without qualification, as Mrs. Astor, as though there were only one woman in New York who deserved that name, which was, of course, exactly the point she intended to make. To enforce it, she partnered with a lawyer named Ward McAllister, a man who had made an earlier fortune through legal work tied to California mining claims, and had spent his European travels studying aristocratic etiquette. He then imported wholesale into a country that had never had an aristocracy to begin with. Together they built an invitation list that excluded anyone whose money they judged too new or too recently arrived. And in 1888, McAllister told a reporter from the New York Tribune that fashionable New York society consisted of only about 400 people. Everyone else, he said, was either uncomfortable in a ballroom or made other people uncomfortable in one. For years afterward, it was rumored that the number 400 came from the literal capacity, Miss Astor's own ballroom. That detail is almost certainly a myth that outlived the truth behind it. When an actual list was finally published in 1892, it ran to a little over 300 names, several of them people who had already died without being crossed off. The system Mrs. Astor and McAllister built ran on one rule above all others: money alone was not enough. You also had to be rich in the correct sequence of generations, which is exactly the rule the Vanderbilt family ran directly into in the early 1880s, despite a fortune that by then genuinely dwarfed the Astors. Alva Vanderbilt, married into that money and locked out of the old guard regardless, decided to force the issue rather than wait for it to resolve itself. On the 26th of March, 1883, she staged a costume ball at her newly finished mansion on Fifth Avenue, at a cost most contemporary sources put around $250,000, something in the range of $6 to $7 million today. According to a story that's been repeated for over a century, though historians are careful to flag it as unconfirmed, Mrs. Astor's own daughter had practiced a quadrille for weeks in anticipation of the ball, only to watch every other invitation arrive except her own. Whatever actually happened behind the scenes, the outcome is documented with far more confidence. Mrs. Astor, for the first time in the entire history of her self-appointed authority, was compelled to pay a personal call at the Vanderbilt mansion and leave her calling card, the required first step before any invitation could properly follow. It arrived the next day. On the night of the ball itself, roughly 1,200 guests arrived, with police stationed outside simply to hold back the crowds who'd come to watch from the street. Mrs. Astor attended in person, in costume, walking through the doors of a house she had spent years treating as beneath her notice. It took a rival fortune with more money and more patience than she had ever anticipated to prove that the wall she'd built by pure declaration had a door in it after all. That same instinct for control that had let her invent an entire social hierarchy by simply saying it existed was about to collide with someone inside her own family who wanted the identical authority for himself, and had far more patience for revenge than the Vanderbilts had needed. Her husband's nephew, William Waldorf-Astor, believed that as head of the senior branch of the family, his own wife, not his aunt, deserved to be addressed without qualification as Mrs. Astor. Caroline refused to share the title she'd spent decades building. Neither side would move, and unlike Alva Vanderbilt, William didn't need one spectacular evening to force the issue. He owned the building directly beside his own Fifth Avenue mansion, the one his father had left him, and in 1893 he tore it down and began building a 13-story hotel on the exact same footprint, positioned specifically to overshadow and disrupt her privacy. He named it, in a detail that connects all the way back to the very start of this story, the Waldorf, a word carried a full century out of a small German village near Heidelberg and carved permanently into the stone of a New York hotel, built as a weapon in a family argument. By then he had already left the country over the dispute. In 1891, he told American reporters, in terms with no ambiguity, that the newspapers made his country unfit for a gentleman to live in, and he moved his wife and children to London. He had genuine reasons beyond wounded pride. A persistent fear that his own children could be targeted for kidnapping shaped a great deal of what came next. But the humiliation over the family title clearly stayed with him, because a year after arriving in England, in July of 1892, American newspapers reported that the 45-year-old Astor had died suddenly of pneumonia. True. Reporters quickly found him alive, quietly packing, and the surviving correspondence from his own New York estate agents points toward one conclusion historians have settled on since. He arranged the false report himself, apparently hoping to see how the world would remember him, or simply to disappear from a public life he'd come to despise. It followed him for the rest of his life instead. What followed the failed hoax was a genuinely difficult stretch for him, separate from the public embarrassment. His wife, Mary, died in December of 1894, at 36, leaving him a widower with 5 children in a country neither of them had grown up in. He withdrew further after that, building a fortified estate at Hever Castle in Kent, complete with electrically operated security gates, unusually early technology for an English country house. And eventually earning England, at least, gave him what New York never had: unambiguous recognition, in the form of a peerage. He became Baron Astor of Hever in 1916, and the first Viscount Astor the year after, and when he died in October of 1919, the estate he'd bought in 1893, largely to escape his own private grief, Cliveden, passed to his eldest son as a wedding gift. Under that son and his American wife, who would go on to become the first woman ever to sit in the British House of Commons. Cliveden turned it into one of the more consequential addresses in English political life through the 1930s, hosting the political circle later blamed, with some historical dispute over how fairly, for supporting the doomed policy of appeasing Hitler before the Second World War, made position untenable. Back in New York, the branch of the family that stayed did something with the Waldorf-Astoria feud that neither side had planned. They made each other richer. William's cousin, John Jacob Astor IV, initially wanted to demolish his own mother's mansion next door and replace it with stables, specifically to let the smell drift toward his cousin's new hotel. He didn't go through with it. The two men remained bound together by roughly $200 million in shared real estate interests, which put a hard ceiling on how far spite was worth pursuing, and built a taller hotel instead. The Astoria, completed in 1897, rose 3 full floors above the Waldorf next door, and the two buildings were eventually joined by a connecting corridor, later nicknamed Peacock Alley, with a legal clause built into the arrangement allowing either side to brick the passage shut again if the feud ever reignited. It didn't. The combined Waldorf-Astoria became the largest hotel world at the time, and John Jacob Astor IV went on to build others, including the St. Regis, establishing himself as a real developer in his own right, rather than simply an heir managing what he'd been given. His personal life carried its own scandal. He divorced his first wife in 1909 after 18 years of marriage, in an era when divorce among families of that standing still generated real public commentary, and remarried 2 years later, at 47, to an 18-year-old named Madeleine Talmadge Force, a gap of 29 years that drew exactly the scrutiny you'd expect. The wedding took place in September of 1911 at his mother's Newport mansion. The couple left almost immediately on an extended honeymoon through Europe and Egypt, in what looks, from the historical record, like a deliberate effort to let the scandal cool before they had to face New York again. Early in 1912, Madeleine became pregnant, and the couple decided to return home so the child could be born on American soil. The ship they booked was the Titanic, sailing on its maiden voyage. They boarded at Cherbourg on the 10th of April, with a suite Astor had personally helped decorate. 4 days later, at 11:40 in the evening, the ship struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. What happened over the following 2 hours has been documented with unusual consistency across multiple survivor accounts. Astor helped Madeleine into lifeboat number 4 and asked the ship's officer, Charles Lightoller, whether he might join her given her condition. Lightoller refused. The rule that night was women and children first, with no exceptions made for wealth or standing, and Astor didn't argue the point further. According to witness testimony given afterward to the U.S. Senate, he asked instead for the number of the lifeboat, so that he might find his wife again once it was safe. He was last seen on deck, smoking, as the boat pulled away. He did not survive. His body was recovered 8 days later by a cable ship sent out specifically to gather the dead, found with cash, a gold watch, and a diamond ring still on him. The wealthiest man on the Titanic and the richest passenger to die in the sinking. His will left the largest share of his fortune to his adult son from his first marriage, as the presumptive heir. Madeline received $100,000 outright, the family's Fifth Avenue house, and a trust fund of $5 million, with one condition attached that would define the rest of her life more than any other clause in the document. If she ever remarried, she would forfeit both the house and the trust entirely. 4 months after the sinking, she gave birth to a son, John Jacob Astor VI, in New York. She did remarry in 1916, and true to the will's terms, gave up both the house and the money exactly as specified. She would go on to marry twice more before her own death in Florida in 1940, at 46. It's worth sitting with that will for a second, because it's a small, precise document that tells you almost everything about what this family had come to value by the 4th generation. Not the person, the name attached to the money, and the terms under which she was allowed to keep touching it. That same instinct, the fortune mattering more than the family member holding it, is exactly what a Manhattan courtroom found itself untangling nearly a century later, in a case that took the Astor name somewhere it had never been before. The defendant's chair. Brooke Astor, who had become the 20th century of Mrs. Astor through her marriage to Vincent Astor, John Jacob Astor, IV's son from his first marriage, spent as one of the country's most visible philanthropists, giving away roughly $200 million to institutions including the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the New York Public Library. The same library her husband's great-great-grandfather had helped found a century and a half earlier. She died in 2007 at 105, having spent her final years living with Alzheimer's disease. Her only son, Anthony Marshall, was not, in any strict genealogical sense, an Astor at all. He was her son from an earlier marriage, decades before she married into the family, whose name he would later be accused of exploiting. He had genuine achievements of his own behind him. A decorated Marine wounded at Iwo Jima, later a diplomat and a Broadway producer. None of it, by most accounts, was ever quite enough to satisfy his mother's sense of what he should have become. What came to light in her final years, largely through her own grandson going public with his concerns in 2006, described a pattern of isolation and financial exploitation. Art and valuables sold off, medical care allegedly neglected, longtime staff dismissed. The case reached trial in 2009. After a 5-month proceeding and nearly 2 weeks of jury deliberation, Anthony Marshall, then 85, was convicted on 14 of 16 counts, including first-degree grand larceny, to defraud his own mother. His co-defendant, the family's longtime estate lawyer, was convicted separately of forging one of her wills. Marshall was sentenced to prison, delayed the sentence through years of appeals, finally surrendered in 2013, was granted medical parole within months, and died the following year at 90. 230 years separate a young man arriving in Baltimore with $25 and 7 flutes from an 85-year-old man being led out of a Manhattan courtroom in handcuffs. Almost none of the money moved in a straight line between them. It passed through fur, through tenement rent, through a title one woman refused to share, through a hotel built purely out of spite, through a lifeboat number a dying man asked for so he could find his wife. What stayed constant, generation after generation, wasn't the fortune itself. It was the question underneath it, the one this family kept answering differently every single time. Whether the name was something you inherited or something you had to keep earning the right to hold. And by the end, a courtroom had effectively ruled that even blood wasn't enough to settle that question on its own. The village he left behind at 16 never changed. Everything his descendants built on top of it did, again and again, for 2 centuries, until barely any of it had anything left to do with a butcher's son from a small town near Heidelberg. If you had to inherit one piece of this story, the fortune, the name, or the freedom to walk away from both, which one do you think would actually have been worth keeping? Let me know in the comments, and if you want more of these deep dives of the family's history tries hardest to forget, subscribe. There's a new one every day.